Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for another discography ranking, and today it's the final part of our three-part Simon & Garfunkel series. We are going to be looking at the studio albums of one Paul Simon. Okay, I have been waiting to do Paul Simon for quite a while. He was the catalyst for this entire endeavor, and the reason that I decided to do this when I did. I got to see Paul Simon live in April when he went to Minneapolis as part of this kind of final tour, but also comeback tour that he has had going on. And I've always really loved Paul Simon as a songwriter and as a musician, as a singer, everything else. But even getting to see him live, even at this age, I was still surprised by how much I was affected by the concert, how strong of a performance it was by everybody involved, including Simon himself. He just has one of the most titanic and in some ways difficult to reckon with legacies of any 20th century songwriter. And hopefully in kind of getting the chance to talk about his solo material a bit, while his solo material is not nearly as ignored as Art Garfunkel's, let's say, I still think people have a tendency to underestimate him as a solo performer and as a solo songwriter. And a lot of people kind of jump off the train after, let's say, Graceland, which of course was his, in many ways, his biggest success as a solo artist. But as we'll get into here, I think there is a lot of really interesting material to cover. And I hope that you will stay with me as we go through this journey together. I should also say as well that with Paul Simon, a lot of the appeal of him as a songwriter comes from his lyrics and his lyrical ideas. And while we don't have the time here to really delve into Simon as a lyricist in a ton of detail, he's an artist who is very worthy of really in-depth exploration. I think his lyrics are a really interesting balance of being heady at times, but also being very approachable. I think he does a lot of very basic things with wordplay and has a sense of humor in a lot of his songwriting that a lot of people, I think, can appreciate without necessarily going the deep dive route. They're not as abstract of lyrics generally as someone like a Dylan, let's say. They're a bit more grounded and a bit more approachable in that sense. In fact, Simon as a lyricist was really the first songwriter who, when I was a kid and I was getting into his music, he was really the first where I sat there and said, wow, that is actually like really great lyric writing, really clever in a lot of ways. So very worth diving into the lyrics, and I'll kind of touch on them as much as I can through this discography because it is a very important part of the Simon oeuvre. Okay, so there are 15 studio albums that we are going to be looking at today. That's 14 proper studio albums plus the One Trick Pony film soundtrack, which again is, for all intents and purposes, a normal Paul Simon studio album. So no real differences there. We are not including any live records, as is consistently the case, but I will call out the 1974 live Rhymin record as a really, I think, important piece of kind of early solo career development for Paul Simon. You get to hear a lot of his solo songs as well as him performing some Simon & Garfunkel tracks live for the first time, if I'm not mistaken. A really good live record and definitely worth checking out just to kind of augment the strength of Simon's early 70s work. There are several other live albums that I have not heard, but did want to call out that one specifically. And the last thing I will say before we get into this is I like this discography a lot. My number 15 was very easy for me to rank, and that was about it. Pretty much everything else has a ton of flexibility. A lot of records actually even grew on me a little bit more during this listen. So again, this is going to be me sort of just spouting about how much I love these records. Don't take the actual rankings too seriously. And if you do, and if you get upset by where I place something, frankly, that is your problem, not mine. Okay? All right, let's get into it. Okay, as I said, my number 15 was a pretty easy choice for me to make. It is 1997's Songs from the Capeman. Here's the thing about Songs from the Capeman. I went into this kind of re-exploration of Simon's discography because I'd heard all these albums before, with the understanding that I hated this record. I thought this thing was terrible the first time that I listened to it. And after listening to it again, I think it's decent. I cannot imagine I'm going to ever think it's more than that, but I do think it's decent. Of course, this is the sort of accompanying record to the Broadway musical that Simon wrote and created in the late 1990s, which was a huge flop, just complete commercial flop, closed after like 2 months or something ridiculous. And the musical itself, I've not seen any bootlegs of it. I've heard that it's actually like fairly decent and that the songs themselves are good, which makes sense because the songs on here actually I think are for the most part pretty okay. Now, the problem here, and Paul Simon's not the only artist who's done this. Elton John has done this type of thing too, where they will, in order to try to boost sales of the Broadway show, they will record the soundtrack, a lot of the songs from the musical, and release it as a standalone record. Now, the problem here is that means that Paul Simon is effectively playing the role of the main character, playing the role of like a Puerto Rican teenager, and that doesn't work. It's a decision that I suppose maybe they had to make if they were intending to release this record as anything. It wouldn't make much sense for Paul Simon to play a side character on his own album, but stylistically it doesn't work, and that is never more evident than the opening track Adios Hermanos, where Paul Simon fails the don't say the N-word challenge in less than a minute and a half. That's one of a couple of occasions on this record where he spouts out racial slurs in character, but still. So that first track, complete just swing and a miss. I mean, you cannot, I cannot anyways, get past that sort of mental, like that this mental barrier here, the idea that Simon is playing this character. Things stabilize a lot after that, though. It's a record that makes a terrible first impression, but everything else works okay. Again, I think Simon in the role of this main character is an odd fit with some of the lyrics he's being told to say, and there are times when he switches back and forth between like the character and his like dad or his uncle or something like that, and it gets a bit confusing to keep track of. But the tunes themselves are sharp. I mean, Simon was working on such a high level consistently for so long that, you know, even this set of tracks, which is not among the stronger bits of work that he's ever made, still works pretty well. I think Satin Summer Nights is pretty good. Killer Wants to Go to College is okay. I think Virgil has some great guitar licks on it. That was a standout for me this time around. It's an oddball, a complete oddball of a record, though. And I just could not imagine this being not even the first exposure someone had to Paul Simon, but like this is something you listen to after you've heard everything else. I don't think there's a whole lot that I would go back to, but the musicianship is pretty quality throughout. I think the lyrics are good for what they are. If you engage with the record on its own terms, it's fine, in my book anyways. But a lot of issues, a lot of flaws that I have with just the whole kind of concept, the whole premise of the thing, prevent me from really enjoying it on a level anywhere close to literally any of his other records. Songs from the Capeman, 1997, my easy number 15, Paul Simon. At number 14, I have 1980's One Trick Pony. The soundtrack record, again, even though it's ostensibly just a normal Paul Simon album. And I'm sure there are some people who are not going to understand why this record comes in so low. I still think it's really good to great. It's a really, really strong album. But I do think it's easily his weakest solo record of the first part of his catalog, and even just across the board, I think weaker than most other things he put out, which is a testament mostly to how strong the later records are than a knock against this record. I think where I struggle a bit with One Trick Pony is that I think it is maybe a bit less unique in its identity than most other Paul Simon records. I can go to pretty much any other Simon record and pull something out that is distinctive about it, some sort of distinctive quality that separates it from everything else in his catalog, even Capeman, for better or for worse. And I can't really do that with One Trick Pony. It very much sounds like an amalgamation of what he had done on his last couple of solo records, as well as kind of a prelude to what he would do on Hearts and Bones later on. And I think all those other records are more successful in what they are trying to do than One Trick Pony is. And that's what hurts it a bit, relatively speaking. That said, it's Paul Simon in this era, so the songs are still great. I think the opening track, Late in the Evening, is one of his best songs from the era. It's the easy standout on the record for me. Really great percussion work on here. In fact, the kind of whole vibe of that song, the kind of expansive sound with the prominent guitars, seems very much like a dry run for the textures that he will experiment with on Graceland later on. I think there's a very clear connection there. But again, I do think it is easily my favorite song on the record, and most everything else, there's nothing here that I would say underwhelmed me, really. There's some good songs, like the title track is good. I really like how the heart approaches what it yearns. Jonah on the B-side, God Bless the Absentee. There's some strong tracks on here. But I do think everything else is, again, comparable in quality to like a lot of the tracks on something like Still Crazy After All These Years or Hearts and Bones, without necessarily having the same highlights. And again, if I'm going to go for that particular sound, if I'm craving that particular sound, I suppose, I'm going to go for those two records. I'm not necessarily going to go to this one first. Yeah, it's a great album, and it's, again, over time, this is one that I could have a light bulb moment with, and it could raise up my rankings even more. In fact, it's probably likely that will happen at some point. But for the time being, it's not a very distinct record in his catalog. It doesn't have a super strong identity unto itself. And if it does have one, it's just because of its attachment to the movie, which also was a flop. So yeah, One Trick Pony, my number 14, a really good to potentially even great album. But there are 13 more that I like a bit more than that. At number 13, I have 2018's In the Blue Light. The re-recordings album that Simon put out, and actually one that I thought was going to end up being kind of his final statement for a while. I remember when it came out. And in many ways, this is a retrospective, a reflection on his career. And I'm not necessarily someone I'm not anti-re-recordings by any means, but it's usually not something that inspires a lot of joy, I suppose, a lot of intrigue. And I remember liking it at that point, but if any record like exploded on me from like a growth standpoint that really grew on me with this exploration, it was this one. This might have grown on me more than any other individual record, which is pretty remarkable. Now, again, I can only get so excited about the thing in concept, but I don't think I've heard another re-recordings record that has this much ambition in what it's trying to do. It genuinely feels like Simon is not trying to capture what the songs were, but to update them for a different era, or just to try to repurpose them into a different package altogether. A lot of these tracks are basically, they have their instrumental palettes kind of completely altered. Sometimes in a way that is still reminiscent of the original recordings, but oftentimes completely different as well. And you mix that by also having Simon just straight up changing lyrics to songs at points, making some major lyrical changes to different verses and things like that to try to update the track for a new era, take into account more like contemporary concerns rather than ones that are dated back to the 70s and 80s or what have you. And it always works. Like, I think every decision that he makes here works on some level. It never feels like such a radical remake of a song that it tears apart what was good about it initially. It always feels like it enhances it on some level. And I think it helps, too, that the songs that Simon chooses to re-record are not his hits per se. but a lot of these are just deep cuts, essentially. Now, sometimes I think the song choices are a little bit odd. I think like You're the One has something like 3 or 4 songs on here that are re-recorded, which is kind of funny. But again, even those tracks coming off of an album that is not generally considered to be one of his stronger ones work pretty well in this adjusted context. I like the recording of Darling Lorraine on here, one of the stronger tracks off that album. Pig, Sheep, and Wolves is not one of the stronger tracks on that album, but now in this reinterpretation with this like Dixieland jazz backing that they have going on here, I think it works really well. The track Can't Run But, one of my favorites off of Rhythm of the Saints, gets put on here, and it has this like string quartet feel arranged by Bryce Dessner from The National, My Beloved. That works really well. Also another track with some very tangible kind of lyrical changes about feeling out of place in contemporary music environments and that sort of thing. Really cool idea. Some Folks' Lives Roll Easy, one of a couple tracks on here that has this very like romantic breed of jazz incorporated into the arrangements. Very like hypnotic piano patterns on that particular track. Wynton Marsalis also comes up quite a few times here, appearing on various tracks. It captivated me. I was always intrigued by the choices that he was making, that Simon was making, and the changes that he made to these tracks. And again, for the most part, I liked all of these the first go around with their respective records. And he's jumping back all the way from like, you know, early to mid 70s songs to Questions for the Angels, which had just come out a few years prior on So Beautiful or So What. But in a way, hearing this reinterpretation here still, I think, enhanced my appreciation for the songs on some level. So in a way, this record does exactly what a re-recordings album should strive to do. And in that sense, I think it is the best example of that I can think of. Genuinely a great record. I think one that is easily slept on by a lot of people, but absolutely worth checking out, absolutely worth exploring in depth. Give it another chance if you heard it before and weren't super into it. In the Blue Light by Paul Simon, my number 13. At number 12, I have 2000's You're the One. I was talking about this record a little bit in the last one. This is not an album that is generally considered to be among Paul Simon's greatest, and I can understand why. It certainly feels like one of the least ambitious projects of his career, maybe the least ambitious in a way. It certainly has the least kind of frills and conceits of any Paul Simon record that had been put out at that point since like Hearts and Bones. And in that sense, I think sonically, you're not really going to argue that this is a more interesting record than something like Graceland or Rhythm of the Saints. I think it is undoubtedly less interesting in that way. But I do think centering just the songs and the songwriting here is a smart move. Even if, again, it isn't necessarily his best collection of tracks. And I don't think it's like entirely sonically one note, right? It's not necessarily just a very one-dimensional, overcompressed early 2000s singer-songwriter record. Still very solid like percussion elements here on a lot of these tracks, which really elevates it. The guitar as an instrument is still very, very prominent, which I think is a major plus. Some really cool like electric guitar runs and things in a lot of these tracks. So it's still a stimulating record in that sense, which I think is cool. I like the opening track, That's Where I Belong, but the second track in the listing, Darling Lorraine, I think is the centerpiece of the album. One of his best tracks from the entire 90s, 2000s run. Just a absolutely beautiful, gorgeous song about, about a relationship kind of on the rocks and about aging and things like that. This is very much Simon getting into his kind of middle-aged era as a songwriter, really starting to reflect on these themes, which will become super consistent across his later work. The track Old is excellent as well. I'm really partial to Senorita with a Necklace of Tears. Hurricane Eye has some of the most aggressive guitar work on the record. That one's a definite standout. And bringing it back to Pigs, Sheep, and Wolves, which I talked about in the Blue Light, definitely the most polarizing track on the record, and often considered to be a low light of the album and of Paul Simon's entire career. I wouldn't necessarily go that far, although there aren't enough Paul Simon tracks that are complete duds for me to say that this isn't maybe one of the worst songs of his career, relatively speaking. The kind of Orwellian framing in the lyrics here, very Animal Farm-like, is maybe... it almost seems a bit over-engaged in its delivery, perhaps. It's very enthusiastic, and the kind of whining tone that Simon has in his kind of almost spoken word delivery is not necessarily going to be everybody's cup of tea. So you can see why this is not necessarily considered a highlight. But I think it has its place, I think, in the Simon catalog. I don't think it's a complete misfire. And this record is, again, I think one of the most anonymous things in Simon's catalog from a public perception standpoint, but I do think that a lot of his strengths as a songwriter are still on display. I think the lyrics here are great, often clever, and often very affecting, often very moving as well. So another record, You're the One, where I would say it's worth a revisit if you have not necessarily been taken by it before. It might grow on you. It might surprise you. It's a slow burn, I think, by definition, but a pretty rewarding one when all's said and done. You're the One, my number 12. At number 11, I have 2023's Seven Psalms. So this record I actually didn't hear for quite a while after it came out. And, when I did hear it, I was impressed by it, but I didn't necessarily know how much I would appreciate it compared to everything else in his catalog. But what I'll say is this was a record where hearing it live really increased my appreciation for it, I think. The tour that Simon was doing, and I think is still doing as of the recording of this video, he is opening his show. The first half of the show is this album being performed in full. And hearing it in that context was really eye-opening to me. This is very much a record about religion, as the name might suggest. It is an album about mortality as well. Simon writing this record kind of inspired by dreams and things like that he was having around the time of like COVID. And COVID at points is very explicitly mentioned in the lyrics in the context of COVID, as a symbol of people's mortality, especially older people. And so what we have here is this song cycle, because that's how it's advertised. It's not really 7 distinct tracks, 7 distinct songs. It's all meant to be kind of listened to as a collective. And for what it is, it's very affecting. And, it pivots from what Simon was doing in his other 2010s records, maybe drawing a little bit on some of the softer influences, the more meditative, almost rhythm-free at points, the most free-form elements of In the Blue Light and the arrangements there. It kind of draws from that and extrapolates that across a big chunk of a record. A lot of these songs don't feel like they have a strong sense of direction. They feel very meditative. They feel very plaintive and stationary, like they're just kind of meditating upon themselves without necessarily feeling the need to move forward. Maybe because there's an anxiety of moving. Maybe there's a whole metaphor you could use here as far as there's an anxiety about moving forward because, no one knows what the future holds, that sort of thing. Anyways, instrumentally, it's very striking, though, in those moments. And despite the heavy-handed subject matter, which may not be to everybody's cup of tea, you still get some of the even more sardonic and humorous elements of Simon's songwriting. My professional opinion is one of the pieces of this song cycle that jumps out to me as being pretty humorous at points. But again, it is very tranquil. It is very very spiritual. It is, I think, very, very easily Paul Simon's most spiritual record, with some very, very explicit lyrics about God and, of course, the Lord and that sort of thing. Edie Brickell, his wife, comes in to bring vocals on a couple of the tracks later on in the track listing. It's a meditative record. It is, again, something where some people may feel a very strong personal connection to it. And even if I'm not necessarily a spiritual person myself, I think, again, it was hearing it live and seeing this man, 83 years old, 82, 83 years old at this point, performing these songs about mortality and about meeting your maker and that sort of thing. That image was very powerful, and it kind of made me reflect on imagining if, like, Leonard Cohen got to perform the You Want It Darker record live and how it would feel seeing that. And that would be pretty remarkable. That'd be pretty kind of impossible to describe. And I think this was the closest that I will get to anyways to experiencing that. So Paul Simon, 7 Psalms, my number 11. At number 10, I have 1975's Still Crazy After All These Years. It's interesting. This is a record that I always kind of go in expecting that I enjoy more than I do, because some of the tracks on here, and certainly there are moments on here that are as good as anything Paul Simon ever did for my money. But as much as I still think it's really great, it's a great album. I think it's one that doesn't always work for me in totality as like a full length listen. I think it comes down ultimately to the production of it. I talked about this in the Art Garfunkel video with the record Breakaway from the same year. There is a very particular mid-70s sound to both of these albums that is very comparable, very kind of electric piano dominant, and very sort of clean and polished and that sort of thing. And I think Simon's songs in this presentation can have their impact dulled a little bit. It's not necessarily like when I compare how these songs hit compared to like There Goes Rhymin' Simon or something like that, I realize that for, Rhymin' Simon has some really just powerful, like incisive moments of songwriting, whereas this record, it oftentimes feels like a very general kind of sense of pleasantness throughout the whole thing. And there's nothing wrong with that. But again, it's where I think the impact of this record as a full-length listen is dulled a little bit for me. Now, the only other thing I would say is a quote-unquote gripe, because I still do like the song, is the track Gone at Last is admittedly one of my least favorite Paul Simon hits, as it were. Never really been a song that I've connected to. It kind of stands apart from everything else on the record in an odd way, which would be a plus in some sense, but I don't know. I don't necessarily connect with the gospel vibe on this track quite as much. I don't think that Simon necessarily works in that particular vibe with that type of energy. But again, this record has a lot of songs that I think at their core are very, very strong tracks and some really big high points. The opening track, the title track in particular, I think does a lot of legwork for starting this album on a positive note. It is one of my absolute favorite Paul Simon songs. I think it is a brilliant bit of songwriting. The chordal choices are excellent. I love playing this thing on the piano. I think Simon's vocals on here are great. Simon vocally actually is pretty sharp on the whole thing. I think Some Folks' Lives Roll Easy is another one where his voice is a pretty big standout. But title track, absolutely superb. Brilliant, brilliant song. My Little Town, the Art Garfunkel duet, is really great. I think it works in that it doesn't really draw attention to itself, given that it was, the Simon and Garfunkel reunion track and ended up being, I think, the only one that they ever put out together as a duet. It doesn't feel self-conscious about that. It doesn't make a big showing of saying, hey, we're back together. It's just they're throwing out a song that probably would have fit perfectly well if they had stayed together and recorded another early 70s album, and it works really, really, really well. I know 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover can be a bit polarizing. Some people not keen on the chorus of that track, for instance, but I think the core groove of the song is the appeal. It is the Steve Gadd drum part, which also got to see Steve Gadd himself play that drum part at the Paul Simon show, which was unbelievable, really cool. Yeah, I think it's a silly song. It's a goofy song for sure, but I have a good time with it. I can't get enough of it. Again, I think the B-side is a little bit weaker on this record from a sequencing standpoint, but it closes really well with Silent Eyes, this like piano-centric closer that is very affecting. So, I don't know. In a way, this is a record that for the most part is really, really consistent, a la like You're the One, let's say, but it has some remarkably high points, which is why I think it bumps up a little bit in my rankings. I guess technically by definition, this is my least favorite 70s Paul Simon record, but 70s Paul Simon is still incredibly strong. So make sure you check this album out if you haven't. Still crazy after all these years, my number 10. At number 9, I have 2006's Surprise. It's been interesting to me, and I'm not sure if this is just my own experience reading this or if this is actually reflective of what the popular opinion of this album is, but I remember, I know when this came out, this record was very, very popular. A lot of people commenting on it as one of the best Paul Simon records in a very, very long time. But as time has gone on, and perhaps as Simon has released other records, I think this album has lowered a little bit in the popular consciousness, perhaps some of it being due to the production techniques on it. Of course, the big deal here is that Brian Eno is kind of the main guy collaborating with Simon here. He's the one bringing in the production and some of his own tastes and quirks and things like that into the proceedings. And as a result, this is a record that sounds dated on a couple of levels. I'm not going to deny that piece of it. It sounds 2000s in the sort of compression of what is going on, but I think the actual like synth sounds and the kind of guitar sounds and glitches and things like that Eno is bringing in are a little bit more 90s like, kind of gives me vibes of like stuff that he was doing with Bowie a little bit. So in both those senses, it's a record that sounds very much of a certain time, and I can understand there being some hesitation there. But what I like about it and what I think works extremely well and why I think this record is still worth the hype is that I think Eno is pushing Simon in a really interesting way, in a way that none of his other collaborators did before or really have since. The textures that he's kind of throwing around are constantly moving and constantly changing. And the kind of end result is when you mix that with Simon's voice and Simon's lyrics here, it's one of the most consistently uncomfortable things that Paul Simon has ever put out. It always feels a little bit kind of cloistered and very busy. And I don't know, I really appreciate that. I think that's a really cool and distinct vibe. And I think this is a moment where you can see Simon, again, keeping his eyes moving forward and experimenting with different things. If something like You're the One is a sort of moment of coasting in his career, this is him pressing the gas pedal and turning the wheel to the left. Lots of great songs on here. The opening track, How Can You Live in the Northeast, is excellent. Actually, that opening 3-song run, How Can You Live in the Northeast, everything about it is a love song, both great. Outrageous, one of my favorite songs from this era of Paul Simon. Just super self-aware, self-effacing lyrics on here, which Simon does, I think, actually quite a bit in his lyricism. He's always willing to kind of poke fun at himself in a way that I think is charming. So I love it when he does that on moments like Outrageous. Really cool. Wartime Prayers, really beautiful song. Love the kind of ideas there. I Don't Believe is one of my favorite Simon vocals from this latter stage of his career. They're so soft here that at one point they almost sound kind of like Garfunkel-like, even, which is really cool. And of course, I think a lot of people are partial to the tracks that Simon wrote about his kids, namely the track Beautiful, which I think is pretty good, and then the closing track Father and Daughter, which is really outstanding. I think that's another one where some people I've seen some people gripe that it would have been better with a different production sound, and maybe that's a track that could have been an interesting one to redo with the In the Blue Light concept, right? And try to reorchestrate that in some way. But I'm not that distracted by the kind of electronics going on with that track. I still think it's very charming, very beautiful in that kind of mid-2000s way. And yeah, I think Surprise, again, for as much as I think it is a little bit less kind of era transcendent than some of Simon's other records, is still forward thinking and is still him creatively pushing himself. And that has a lot of value to me. And that is exactly why Surprise comes in at my number 9 slot. Really, really great record. At number 8, I have the self-titled record from 1972. Great album. Again, not Simon's debut solo record, of course, but the one that launched his true solo career. And in that sense, really, really successful. And it's a record that I think kind of feels like a flex, even if it really isn't. This is, when you contextualize it after Bridge Over Troubled Water came out, where you can hear Simon starting to really play around with sonic ideas and things like that. It's easily the most sonically diverse Simon and Garfunkel record. This solo album here is Simon writing a bunch of incredibly strong songs with these pretty diverse instrumental arrangements that build off of what he was doing on Bridge Over Troubled Water, while also foreshadowing his 80s work and what he would do after that. I think the singles on this record are not necessarily like the across the board best songs on the record by any means, but they're certainly, I think, strong contenders. Mother and Child Reunion and Me and Julio Down by the Schoolyard. Both of those tracks, superb songs. I think they are in many ways dry runs for what Simon will do later on Graceland and Rhythm of the Saints, with these just super like absurdly good hooks. With, again, the emphasis on percussion and things like that, which is really cool. The track Duncan is the other song that I would throw out as a best song contender. I think it's an absolutely stunning bit of acoustic guitar work. One of his best, just straightforward acoustic focus tracks. Really excellent track there. And really, there are actually several moments on this album where you get to hear Simon's acoustic guitar skills and really appreciate why, he was, I think, genuinely, without, even separating himself from the songwriting, I think Simon was one of the most important and skilled acoustic guitar players in popular music at that point, and really throughout much of his career. Peace Like a River is another track that jumps out to me in that sense. I think, again, if we're splitting hairs and trying to explain the rationale for these rankings, I think this record slows down quite a bit after Peace Like a River. I think that run of like Papa Hobo, Hobo's Blues, and Paranoia Blues, nothing bad about them by any means, but they feel very kind of like, they feel very minimal, I suppose, in the overall scheme of things. They feel the closest to like, so-called throwaway tracks that you have throughout a lot of Simon's discography, frankly. And for as much as they're well executed for what they are, and again, I don't want to disrespect them in any way, I think the record that came out after this and some of the other ones that I have above this have a more consistently thought through, a more consistently executed stretch of songs throughout the entire runtime. So that is kind of the very, that is my rationale for putting this record where it is. But a lot of strong songs like the ones I mentioned, Run That Body Down, another one that I think is great. And yeah, self-titled Paul Simon album, I think sets the stage very thoroughly for what he will do later on, and foreshadows not just the quality songwriting, but also some of the experimentation that he will do with different styles, different cultural musics and things like that. So self-titled Paul Simon record comes in at my number 8. At number 7, I have 2011's So Beautiful or So What. Great album. I'm going to repeat myself with all of these, but it's the truth. And the thing about So Beautiful or So What that makes it great is it comes down to the dynamics here. As I said with Surprise, I can understand the production of that record being a critique. And I do think if there's one thing that the compression of it sort of removes, its dynamic contrasts. I don't think that record is very prominent in that sense. And So Beautiful or So What really makes a point of accentuating that, I think. It feels like it lives and breathes more than Surprise does, which is cool. I think the acoustic guitars in particular sound really terrific here, and definitely separate themselves in the mix. And apart from that, I think there are still some moments on the record that sound like what he was doing before. I think the opening track, Getting Ready for Christmas Day, is probably the closest this record sounds to Surprise as far as how just busy it is overall. But beyond that, I think you have an album that maybe isn't going for... Again, I think this is maybe a little bit more of a grab bag of different styles than it is Simon trying to work in one particular milieu or one particular approach for an extended period of time. You have a mixture of songs with very kind of percussive and guitar heavy beats with tracks that are a little bit more kind of reflective. This is an album where you are starting to see some of the spiritual reflection that Simon will continue to work off of on especially Seven Psalms, of course, later on. Tracks like The Afterlife on here, the absolutely beautiful Questions for the Angels, really love that song. I'm also partial to Rewrite and the track Love is Eternal, Sacred Light on here. And the closing track, the title track, is just one of my absolute favorite late career Paul Simon tracks. I think the guitar line mixed with the drum pattern on that song is really, really cool. Just drives itself forward the whole time. Really kind of nice, upbeat way to close a record that goes through a lot of different changes. Phil Ramone, also the producer on this one, just to shout that out. And I think that certainly plays a role into the dynamics of it, which is cool. Yeah, it's... Again, I think maybe you could argue it has a bit less of an identity than some other Paul Simon records, but I think what So Beautiful or So What does so well is it contains very strong, consistent, and interesting songwriting mixed with a collection of tracks that, in a way, is some of Simon's most approachable music, I think, of this era, but still, I think, beguiling and intriguing in a way that a lot of his best stuff from the era is. So I would honestly say if you have not jumped into this later phase of Paul Simon's career, if you kind of stopped after Graceland and Rhythm of the Saints and what have you, I think this could be the record to start with. I think it is going to be the easiest, I think, to jump into, and then from there you can kind of make your way to some of the other kind of more abstract stuff as well. So Beautiful or So What, my number 7, really great album, highly worth checking it out. At number 6, I have 1973's There Goes Rhymin' Simon. Really, really nice evolution from the previous record. A lot tighter, I think, of an album than the self-titled record is. And that, in so many ways, I think plays to the strength of the songwriting on here, into the sequencing of this record. It is absolutely not an album that feels like it tails off in the second half compared to the self-titled record, which I think does that a little bit. It starts strong and it ends strong. The opening track, Kodachrome, one of the absolute best Paul Simon songs, one of the most popular songs of his on radio and things like that, and there's a good reason for that. There's hooks out the ass on this thing. We talk about Paul Simon as a lyricist, we talk about Paul Simon as an acoustic guitarist, but one thing that I don't think can be ignored is his ability as a melodist as well. I think that's probably most evident on the Simon and Garfunkel tracks, because the melodies he writes on those songs are nothing short of extraordinary, and they're accentuated in a very interesting way by that two-part harmony. But his solo career has a lot of those moments too, and Kodachrome is one. There's so many cool ideas in that song, and again, very clever lyrics. I definitely noticed that there are more evident gospel influences on this record compared to the self-titled, but in a way, it's interesting because you can compare this record again to like Art Garfunkel's debut record, Angel Clare, And one of the issues that I had with that Garfunkel record was that there were points where the production of everything tries to go for the Bridge Over Troubled Water sound a little bit. Just massive mega production that doesn't necessarily serve his voice. And that hurts that record a little bit for me. But There Goes Rhymin' Simon doesn't lean into that. It still feels very clean. It still feels very organic. And because Simon, in many ways, is not as strong of a singer as Art Garfunkel was at that point, it works so much more effectively for his own voice. So that's really nice. Take Me to the Mardi Gras is fun. Something So Right is great. One Man's Ceiling is Another Man's Floor. Just a super laid back groove. Love that whole vibe of that song. And another one that he redid very convincingly on In the Blue Light. Love that version of it too. Learn How to Fall is excellent. St. Judy's Comet is a lovely song about his son. That's a really, really just beautiful track. Love to hear that when he performed that one live when I saw him. And then it ends with the great Loves Me Like a Rock. Again, another one kind of setting him up for some of the ideas that he will explore later on in the 80s and that sort of thing. Great kind of backing vocal chorus here that makes the whole track so engaging in such a fun way. Yeah, it's well sequenced in a way that the record before it isn't as much. And the songwriting is consistently sharp. It's Paul Simon operating at that same level that he was in the Bridge Over Troubled Water era. And I think out of his 70s records, this is the closest that he gets to equaling that late period Simon and Garfunkel run. Excellent stuff. There Goes Rhymin' Simon. Terrific record. Highly worth checking out. It's my number 6. At number 5, I have 1965's The Paul Simon Songbook. So, the common rhetoric, the common line of thinking with the Paul Simon Songbook is, well, it's not really an essential release because most of these songs, almost all of them, were recorded with Simon and Garfunkel. So why would you go to this one when you have the Simon and Garfunkel versions? That's fine. I can understand that line of thinking. But as hard as it is to isolate these versions from the Simon and Garfunkel versions, it's necessary to do that if you want to understand the context of when this record came out, which of course was in the middle of 1965 during a period where Simon and Garfunkel had put out one record that had been a flop, and there was no guarantee at that point that they were going to continue in any way as a duo. And so this is Simon recording a bunch of songs. One of them had already been recorded by Simon and Garfunkel, The Sound of Silence, but everything else was new material, mostly written while he was in England. And this is him both auditioning himself potentially as a solo artist and presenting these songs as options for other people to record, right? And when you view it in that lens, and when you view it with the understanding that there is very much a possibility that Simon and Garfunkel never exist and never would have recorded these songs, then you're kind of hit like a freight train when you realize, okay, wow, this is not just like Paul Simon recording Simon and Garfunkel songs. These are just Paul Simon recording his own songs, and it's just a fucking murderer's row of some of the best tracks you will ever hear. Like I Am a Rock, April Come She Will, Sound of Silence, Kathy's Song, Flowers Never Bend with the Rainfall. Even naming just half of these tracks is still leaving out some superb songs on here. But yeah, it's captivating. It's an intimate record because, of course, it's just Simon and acoustic guitar, sounding very similar to the self-titled Jackson C. Frank record from that same year that Simon helped record. It's another record that spotlights his acoustic guitar playing in a very captivating way that I really love. And again, I think even the tracks where Garfunkel's voice is maybe missed the most, like something like The Sound of Silence or He Was My Brother, that's the other one from Wednesday Morning 3 a.m. that I forgot about, it still works pretty well in that solo context. And something like I Am a Rock, I think, feels even more intimate. When it is just Simon performing it, it feels a little bit more, I don't know. It resonates a bit more when it's one person singing that track solo than it does when it's like a cacophony of people singing it in this like folk rock tradition. Like this one feels a bit more raw and it feels a bit more real in that sense. His version of April Come She Will on here I think is really good. And the tracks that Simon and Garfunkel never recorded, at least not in this form, are really affecting too. A Church is Burning is one of his best vocals on the record for sure. Terrific part there. And The Side of a Hill, some stellar guitar work on that one. That's the one that they incorporate into Scarborough Fair later on as kind of the vocal counterpoint. But this solo version is amazing. Yeah, I mean, I think there's absolutely a realistic version of this world where Simon and Garfunkel do not reunite, and maybe Paul Simon becomes like a Jimmy Webb like staff songwriter or something like that, records some solo material but doesn't have nearly the same prolific career that he would have otherwise. And if that happens, then 50 years down the line or 60 years down the line now, we're talking about the Paul Simon songbook as being one of those like lost classic 60s folk gems in the way that we do something like a Jackson C. Frank. There's very much a realistic world where that happens. And while, again, I think there are other Paul Simon records I would go to before this, I would not really argue with anybody who says that this is just the straight up best collection of Paul Simon songs on any of his solo work. Because it probably is. I mean, there's some a lot of just time, use all the superlative words that you want. Timeless, amazing, generational songs. So many of those on this record. And yeah, underrated as hell, I think, in a lot of ways. I think people don't necessarily understand just how titanic of an achievement this is. And while it's only at my number 5, the Paul Simon Songbook is still a stellar record, probably one of the best 60s folk records, honestly, and highly worth your time. At number 4, I have 2016's Stranger to Stranger. In so many ways, I think this is one of the most ambitious records of Paul Simon's career, possibly his most ambitious in a lot of ways, maybe apart from Graceland. I think there's so much about this record that I love, that I think is so cool, so awesome, and so just consistently captivating. Stranger to Stranger is the most percussion-driven record since Rhythm of the Saints. Pretty easily, I think, too. And that whole vibe is absolutely up my alley. And you have, of course, this whole bit where Simon is not only experimenting with these, like, very percussive, heavy timbres and things like that, but he's also experimenting with, like, these, like, microtonal aspects and things like that. And the microtonality piece, I don't think, is something that's important to understand for appreciating this record. And I'm not going to pretend like I can conclusively point out where that's coming up in the album, but it's still a sign, again, of Simon's ambition, that Simon is continuing to try to push himself forward and try to fuck around and experiment with different things. But what draws me to this record more than the other, like, late career stuff, more than the other 2000s and onward stuff, is that there are a lot of those records. It really feels like Simon is sort of taking his songwriting style, and the songwriting style that he's cultivated since the 70s and whatnot, and applying that to different scenarios, to different textures. You can take a song off of something like Graceland and put it onto There Goes Rhymin' Simon with that same, like, backing band, and it would fit pretty well, because I think at its core, there's a lot of elements of Graceland that translate very closely to what Simon was doing in the early 70s. And you kind of get that sense throughout a lot of his career. Stranger to Stranger, though, it feels like Simon is actually, like, experimenting with how he writes songs and how he, like, approaches vocal delivery, how he structures things. There's not as much in the way of, like, refrains and things like that on this record. He kind of is tossing that to the side a little bit. And the result is just a fascinating record with a lot of meat to chew on, I suppose. The Werewolf, excellent starting track. Completely, I think, uncharted territory for Paul overall. There's not really a super solid comparison I can make to any other track in his discography from this one. It just totally throws you in the deep end to this whole record. And depending on how you feel about that one, that will either inform your love of the rest of the record, or it might just totally throw you off. Wristband might be my favorite song on the album, though. It's a very, it's one of those kind of like hipster tracks. Paul Simon always has a little bit of like a hipster vibe to him, but this is one of the most like straightforwardly, brazenly hipster things that he's ever that he's ever put out. But again, really cool rhythmic stuff, some cool guitar parts on there. Street Angel is cool. The Riverbank is awesome. Some really great guitar tones here, and then there's a little bit at the end that I think is super hypnotic. The track Cool Papa Bell, shout out to Cool Papa Bell, great African-American baseball player from the early 20th century. This track is a song that features a prominent tuba part and Paul Simon saying the word motherfucker, which means, of course, that it is a perfect song. No notes. I will not be taking any questions on this. Stranger to Stranger it's a bizarre album. It's not going to be for everybody. I definitely know some people who think this is one of their least favorite Paul Simon records, and that's whatever. But to me, I think this is as strong of a testament to Simon's artistry as any of his records have been. And I love these types of albums that, just in some ways, still, I think, confuse me a little bit and still make me want to kind of understand more of what he's doing. And Stranger to Stranger does that. And yeah, really cool album. Not much more to say. Check it out if you haven't. Give it a re-listen if you have checked it out and didn't like it. Yeah, I think it's awesome. Stranger to Stranger, my number 4. At number 3, I have 1990's The Rhythm of the Saints. The Graceland follow-up record, which was very popular in its day, for sure. But I think historically has been a little bit underrated, arguably, in some ways. I think some people view this just as Graceland 2.0 and view this as kind of like an attempt to recapture past glories. And I guess I don't really view that in that context at all. I think you can only really call this Graceland 2.0 if you just kind of assume that Simon doing any brand of ethnic music is Graceland 2.0, any brand of different cultural music, whatever. I do think it's hard to argue that this record doesn't have the immediate mass appeal of Graceland. It was very popular at the time, but like this record clearly does not have like the singles that something like Graceland does. There aren't really tracks on here that have the same type of pop radio appeal in the same way. But where I think rhythm in some ways even enhances what Graceland was doing is that there's an even heavier focus on groove, and especially percussion here, that I really adore. We'll talk about kind of groove with Graceland when we get there, but basically I think Graceland is a record where the groove is in the guitars and the bass. And I think that's true of Rhythm of the Saints here a little bit as well, but now that we are experimenting with kind of Brazilian percussive ideas and Brazilian musical ideas and things like that, the drums are playing a much stronger role and a much more driving role in the success of this album than I think they are on Graceland. I think the opening track, The Obvious Child, just how it begins with that kind of drumline style, again, just kind of thrusts you into what you should expect for the rest of the record. Really, really cool vibe. Definitely one of the best songs on the album. The track Can't Run But is one of my favorite Paul Simon tracks, just overall. Again, it's another one where the groove builds on itself, but in a very kind of, it's a different way. It's a very kind of haunting and ethereal vibe, with these kind of like, talking drums and things like that are, giving a sort of pitched percussive element to this. And that sort of hypnotic vibe works perfectly for Simon's vocals and the very kind of repetitive melody and melodic ideas that he's kind of experimenting with here. I think it's brilliant, brilliant song. The Coast is excellent. Further to Fly, I think, has a really great kind of melody. Again, another classic Simon melodic line, I think, here that's really hypnotic. And again, you still get some of that great guitar work and great bass work. I don't mean to say that it's gone here. The track She Moves On has some amazing slap bass on it. I absolutely love it. Yeah, so many great tracks. The Cool River, Spirit Voices, title track, great kind of trio of songs to wrap it up. You know, there's not a whole lot, honestly, separating this record from Graceland for me. I like it at almost an equivalent level. I think Graceland, having both the sort of the cultural immersion with the chart success and the genuinely great pop tunes at points, is maybe just the slight edge for me from a ranking standpoint. But I think the Rhythm of the Saints is absolutely comparable in quality in every respect, pretty much. And another one that is, again, as I said, I think it's kind of overlooked in a lot of aspects, but it deserves a lot more respect put on its name. I think it's trying to do something very different from Graceland, but I do think it has a lot of the same strengths at the same time. So the Rhythm of the Saints, Paul Simon, my number 3. At number 2, I have 1983's Hearts and Bones. Boy, I wanted to put this at number 1. I really did. Because there are some days where I just have to say it's my favorite Paul Simon record. This time around, I think it still feels like it's my favorite Paul Simon record. But admittedly, I did come away absolutely adoring Graceland once again after this listen, so it still gets the nudge. But holy cow, I cannot say enough good things about Hearts and Bones. I think the one gripe that people have with this album that I hear consistently is just the production aspect of it. That it's a little bit too immersed in kind of early 80s textures for it to have aged super well. And I'm not going to necessarily dismiss that as an argument, really. Especially because I had similar barriers with Still Crazy After All These Years that I commented on. And I don't necessarily have a super strong argument for why one record's production bothers me a little bit and this record doesn't. I'm sure there are cogent reasons that I could articulate, but ultimately it just comes down to, hey, sometimes we're just kind of hypocritical with our music tastes and our takes. So it is what it is. But to me, this is one of my favorite crops of Paul Simon songs on any individual record. I just think there's so much of his best songwriting on here and his most profound and critically, I think, his most underrated tracks that come from this record. And it's funny because this is also an album that has some very odd songs too. It's not necessarily a straight up, like, this has weirder moments than a lot of Paul Simon's 70s records. And by weirder moments, I mean stuff like the opening track, Allergies, which is, I think that was the single off of the record, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. Very kind of bizarre track, kind of weird, kind of an odd little hook. But again, it works well, and it's an earworm. And I would say the same thing about the penultimate track on the record, Cars Are Cars, a track that is commonly cited as one of Paul Simon's worst songs. And I'm not going to push back that hard against that take, I suppose. But man, that's another one where it is goofy, and the song is an earworm, and I find myself being rather partial to it on some level. It's certainly not enough to derail the whole record, because pretty much everything else on this record I think is nothing short of great. And there are moments that are transcendent in a way that no other Paul Simon record really gets to for me. The title track, possibly my favorite Paul Simon solo song. It's certainly a contender for that. It's a beautiful, lovely, just expressive piece about, Simon's relationship with the actress Carrie Fisher at that point. And it's just has some beautiful acoustic guitar lines and some, again, just really lovely lyrical ideas on here. It's a record that is very personal to Simon, not in the sense of like all of these tracks are about like relationships and things like that, but these are songs that feel very very much like only Paul Simon could have written them. It feels very specific to his experience. And that is the argument given for why this record, which was initially going to be the Simon and Garfunkel reunion record after the concert in Central Park, that is kind of the reason given for why Simon ended up basically kicking Garfunkel off the project. It's because these songs are very personal to him and very much from his perspective in a lot of ways. Hearts and Bones, I think, is maybe the most intimate version of that, but I think you also have tracks like, I think Too Much, both variations of that kind of fit into that. Train in the Distance is a beautiful song. Really love the kind of, again, slow paced groove. This is one that does feel like kind of an extension of what he was doing on like Still Crazy After all these years, but I think there's a bit more bounce to this track than songs on that album, which is why it kind of works for me a little bit more. And then, you know, two of the last three tracks with Cars Are Cars kind of awkwardly stationed in the middle, I suppose, is a funny little sequencing decision. The two of the last three tracks are two of his best solo songs once again. Renee and Georgette Magritte with their dog After the War is this just gorgeously expressive, impressionistic piece of nostalgia, and very personalized nostalgia. It's Simon talking about kind of the musical experiences, the musical artists and songs that kind of inspired him. In this case, very much an homage to doo-wop music and that sort of thing. And that is very touching. And that is kind of the link between that song and the late great Johnny Ace, which is a beautifully structured song. I think one of, out of all the John Lennon tributes out there, because that's kind of the core of this song and why it was written. Out of all the John Lennon tributes that have been written, I think this one to me is not always the most affecting. I might go to something like Empty Garden by Elton John for that. But this track to me is the most, I don't know, it tells a larger story. It tells a larger story about kind of gun violence and things like that, by comparing Lennon's death to the accidental suicide of Johnny Ace in the 50s, and then the murder of John F. Kennedy and that sort of thing. And it's not really explicit about making it a gun violence song, but there's a thread here about all these three men, all with the first name John or some variation of that, being taken, having their lives cut down in all cases because of some sort of gun-related violence. And yeah, I think it's a really powerful kind of connective tissue there, and a really somber way to end the record, certainly. But again, that's what I think makes it fascinating, is despite the more bizarre moments on this record, there's still a very, very serious element to what is going on, a very personal and very sincere element to everything, and that is very much pushed forward in those last two tracks that I mentioned. So yeah, I don't know. Hearts and Bones, I think, is a fantastic album, and I was really happy to hear three of the songs from this record, Train in the Distance, Renee and Georgette Magritte, and Johnny Ace, all performed live when Simon was in Minneapolis. Just a real treat. Really loved hearing it. Again, on some days, this is my favorite Paul Simon record, as I said. But even if I'm not necessarily going to say that today, I think this is an album that is tremendously underrated and very easy to find, too. You can get vinyl copies of this for super cheap. Listen to it. Check it out. Highly worth your time. One of Paul Simon's best records. And in that sense, I think it probably stands to reason that this is probably one of the best examples of pure just songwriting that you will find. Hearts and Bones, my number 2. And at number 1, I have 1986's Graceland. Yeah, this is everybody's number 1 Paul Simon record. And as much as, it would be kind of fun to cast aside tradition for the sake of this ranking, I can't quite do it. Because there's no real reason to. It's a phenomenal album, and it's worth pretty much all the praise that it's given, I think. And, I know that Graceland has a bit of a reputation, and some people criticize it for being, a sort of white savior album, I suppose. White man does this sort of cultural exploration and tries to insert himself into the discussion and, presents this music centering himself, and that it kind of actually doesn't necessarily do the good for the culture that he thinks it does. It's things like that. Point is, people are not always super positive about the impact of this record. And while that's not a discussion I feel like I want to or am qualified to get into at this point, certainly, I would just submit that I always read Simon's approach to music making as genuinely enthusiastic, and that he genuinely wants to experiment with making that style of music himself first and foremost, and that he does have a desire to share it with other people. And that's kind of the whole crux of the Graceland story, I think, is that desire to experiment, that desire to commiserate with other people making music. I think it's the case here. I think it was the case when he was working with Brazilian rhythms and Puerto Rican rhythms, when he's working with Brian Eno, when he's working with, microtonality, just all these different approaches. It comes from a genuine sense of enthusiasm. And that's what I love about Paul Simon as a songwriter and as a musician. The instrumental palette here is really excellent, and I think it integrates really well with Simon's songwriting, as well as like the very, typically 80s production here. I think people underestimate sometimes just how rooted in the 80s this entire record sound is. There's so much echo. There's so much of the kind of gated reverb effect on the drums and things like that, it falls prey to a lot of the things that people normally criticize about 80s production, but it manages to transcend them, I think, somehow, as a result of, I think, the strength of the songwriting and then the strength of the instrumentals kind of around it. Groove is the name of the game here, and almost pretty much every damn song on the record is layered with a sense of groove that is led by the guitars and bass primarily. And I don't mean to downplay the drumming on this album, especially on tracks like Under African Skies, but I think on this record, the drums are absolutely kind of used as a padding for the guitars and the bass to lock in. This is a record filled with great guitar licks, filled with unbelievable bass guitar playing, courtesy of Bagiti Kumalo, and I hope I'm saying his name correctly. But he also performed live at the concert that I was at, which was really awesome. A lot of people point to You Can Call Me Al as kind of the highlight from like a bass guitar standpoint. And yeah, I'm not going to disagree with you. I think, again, going back to the example of tracks from Graceland that you could put into like a 70s Paul Simon instrumental palette and it would still work, You Can Call Me Al is probably the first example of that. Just a delightful song, just a great melody. Again, some of Simon's, I think, most humorous lyrics in some ways, self-effacing, because it's a whole song about feeling kind of out of place culturally. It's kind of the centerpiece of the album in that sense. And it works because, again, I think Simon has a very kind of self-effacing, self-critiquing style of presenting himself. That works really well. And again, when you have that hook, you have that great brass section and things like that. It's just so good. Excellent stuff. The Boy in the Bubble and Graceland, just a remarkable 1-2 punch. The Boy in the Bubble, again, some great kind of instrumental palettes kind of surrounding it. Really love the kind of synthesizer work on that one. I love just Graceland, again, that's where the guitars kind of come in and really drive kind of the rhythm of everything. Superb song. Diamonds on the Sole of Her Shoes is excellent. Under African Skies, again, I mentioned kind of the drum part there. I think that is definitely a strength. The track Homeless is outstanding. Again, Ladysmith Black Mambazo was the inspiration of this record, and so them getting that very prominent feature there in this very, vocal centric track is really outstanding. Now, having said that, a part of me does like the kind of Rockin' Dopsy feature a little bit more on the track That Was Your Mother. I think that one is absolutely a standout of the second half of the record for me. And the Los Lobos track, which may or may not have been just completely ripped off from Los Lobos, is excellent as well, All Around the World, or The Myth of Fingerprints. Yeah, it's one of the most, I think, ubiquitous, one of the most popular records of the 1980s, just across the board. So there's not a whole lot to add to the discourse of it at this point. So again, I think really, if there's anything for me to leave you with as far as my thoughts on Graceland, it's that I think it is a very earnest record above all else. And when you combine that earnestness with someone who is really skilled at songwriting and just some amazing musicians accompanying him, what you're left with is something that is really, really special, and something that definitely I don't think would have been as unique if it had come out like 5 years after the fact. But given the timing of everything, I think given where the 80s was culturally in a lot of ways, I think it sticks out in a very positive way, and sets the stage for a lot of kind of songwriters and like rock and indie rock musicians kind of to come, as far as how they would kind of explore some of these same ideas and integrate that into their own sound. Yeah, Graceland is my number one, as it is for pretty much everybody, I would say. It's a record that's as good as its reputation is, and chances are you've probably heard it. But if you haven't heard it, or if you just need to re-listen because it's been a while, go do so, because you will have a good time. Okay, and that is it. So let me know in the comments what your favorite Paul Simon record is, what your favorite Paul Simon songs are. Did you agree or disagree with this ranking? I'm sure there are going to be some takes that people have a lot of comments on, a lot of questions, especially having as many 2000s records above 70s records as I do. So I would just, again, submit. I think Paul Simon, as far as late career records go, is about as good as it gets. And I think more people need to seriously put him on the level of someone like a David Bowie or someone like that, as far as just consistently making profound and intriguing and always forward moving music later on. I would put up almost any Paul Simon record from the late career to most David Bowie records from like the 2000s and the 2010s and that sort of thing. I think really it is operating at that level. So yeah, check those later career records out if you haven't. Really worth your time, really fascinating stuff. And check out his whole discography, because as I said, I don't think there's one miss here, with the exception of the songs from the Capeman record. Everything else I think is at least great, if not spectacular or sensational. And that's about all I have to say on it. Paul Simon, really great. Really, really grateful that I got to see him live. Just continue to reinforce my opinion that he's one of the best songwriters to really have ever picked up a guitar or musical instrument. Thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more videos are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time, right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.